Welcome back to the Explainer series, Decode Healthcare with Harshal. I'm so pumped you're here for part 3, because today we are going deep. Literally. We're moving way past the surface level and mastering the strict depth-based coding rules for excisional and surgical debridement, specifically focusing on CPT codes 11042 through 11047. So let's not waste any time and jump right in. Okay, we have to start with a pretty jarring reality check. The 2026 compliance landscape is shifting, and the rules of the game, they are tightening up drastically. Picture this: if your clinical documentation relies on vague, wishy-washy phrasing like debrided deep tissue, and you try to bill a surgical code like 1142, that's going to be an automatic audit denial, no questions asked. Payers are totally done guessing. They need explicit, concrete proof. So, to recap what we covered back in part 2, selective debridement, using codes like 97597 is really just about cleaning up the wound surface. You're removing non-viable, devitalized tissue without cutting into the healthy stuff underneath. But the very second a clinician cuts deeper, right past the dermis and into healthy structures like subcutaneous fat, muscle, or bone, we switch code sets entirely. That is the critical threshold.
And this right here perfectly illustrates that transition point. When a provider physically picks up sharp instruments, whether that's a scalpel, a curette, or maybe some tissue scissors, to aggressively cut away dead tissue and actually enter those deeper structures below the dermis, well, we've officially entered the realm of excisional or surgical debridement.
Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer: the 2026 audit reality, the 3 depth tiers, the golden rule, clinical coding scenarios, and finally, compliance and key takeaways. All right, Section 1, the 2026 Audit Reality.
What's actually wild here is that from a pure CPT standpoint, the codes themselves haven't changed a bit, but the documentation expectations, they have been massively reinforced. Practically speaking, you could code a chart absolutely perfectly, but if the notes lack detail, the claim will still get denied. Clinical necessity is basically the ultimate key now. Your coding teams are essentially compliance gatekeepers, and the heavy focus is entirely on proving documented improvement to justify the procedure.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 depth tiers. Okay, go ahead and take a mental screenshot of this matrix. It is literally your definitive guide for mapping excisional codes to the exact anatomical layer being removed. Notice how it's broken down into 3 totally distinct tiers. Tier 1 is subcutaneous tissue, sitting at 11042. Tier 2 goes deeper into muscle and/or fascia, using 11043, and Tier 3 is the absolute deepest, hitting bone, with 11044. Each of these primary codes corresponds strictly to a specific anatomical depth. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. Look closely at how the surface area is handled. Those primary codes we just looked at, they only cover the first 20 square centimeters of the wound. That's it. For every 20 square centimeter increment after that, you absolutely must use the corresponding add-on code from that exact same depth tier. So area matters just as much as depth when you're building out that final code sequence.
Let's hit Section 3, the golden rule.
So this right here is your anchor concept. Your code selection is based entirely on the deepest tissue layer actually excised during the encounter. It is not, and I literally cannot stress this enough, not based on the baseline depth of the wound itself. Think about it like this. If a patient has a wound exposed all the way down to the bone, but the clinician only debrides the subcutaneous fat around the edges today, you code for the fat. You only code for the deepest tissue the scalpel actually removes. This basically means you have to put on your detective hat. Grab your magnifying glass, comb through the provider's operative node, and validate that the specific deepest tissue layer excised is explicitly named. Sure, if the note says debrided down to the muscle, that's great clinical context, but what did they actually cut away? You literally need to see the words necrotic muscle tissue was excised to rightfully bill that 11043.
Let's see this in action. Section 4, clinical coding scenarios.
Let's look at a pretty straightforward presentation first. Say we have a patient with a diabetic foot ulcer. The clinician takes a scalpel and excises 16 square centimeters of necrotic subcutaneous tissue. Simple enough, right? Because the deepest layer removed was subcutaneous fat, we are solidly in Tier 1. And since the total surface area was under 20 square centimeters, CPT code 11042 is our clear winner. Boom, no add-on codes needed. Now, let's step it up to a more complex situation. What if the provider cuts through the fat, extends through the fascia, and progresses all the way into the muscle layer to remove devitalized tissue? Well, our golden rule dictates we code for the deepest layer actually removed. Because they excised muscle tissue, that bumps our primary code up to the second tier. So here we would report CPT code 11043.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Compliance and Key Takeaways.
If you want to survive a 2026 audit, your notes have to tell the full, indisputable clinical story. Auditors are going to be watching like hawks, checking that the specific depth of tissue is explicitly named. Again, absolutely no vague terms. They're going to check your math on the total surface area calculations in square centimeters. They want to see the provider's skill, the exact sharp instruments used, how the patient tolerated the procedure, and crucially, they're tracking clinical progress across multiple visits. You simply have to leave zero room for ambiguity.
Now, I want you to ask yourself this really critical question whenever you review a chart, because you know payers are absolutely looking for this. If a patient is coming in week after week, and the provider is repeatedly performing deep excisional debridement, but the wound measurements aren't shrinking and the tissue isn't improving, what do you think happens? Well, you are entering a zone of extreme red alert audit risk. Repeating these deep excisional procedures without objective proof that the wound is actually improving, or without a documented change to the care plan when a wound stalls, is a massive red flag. That is going to trigger immediate scrutiny from payers.
So keep this formula top of mind every time you look at a record. Debridement coding equals the procedure plus the proof of medical necessity. Selecting the right anatomical CPT code using the golden rule, that's really only half the battle. The other half is acting as that compliance gatekeeper to prove exactly why cutting into that deep tissue was medically necessary today and how it's actively helping the patient heal. Okay, let's lock in our 3 major takeaways for today's explainer, so you're fully prepared to safeguard your organization's revenue. Number 1, Excisional codes 11042 through 11047 require cutting below the dermis into deeper structures using sharp instruments. Number 2, never ever forget the golden rule. Always code based on the deepest tissue layer actually excised, not just what's visually exposed in the wound bed. And number 3, 2026 compliance absolutely demands explicit documentation of specific tissue layers and measurable clinical progress.
And that wraps up our dive into depth-based coding. But what happens when a patient has multiple wounds of varying depths, and you have to combine surface areas? Yeah, it's like a giant puzzle and it gets tricky fast. Join me next time as we tackle complex surface area calculations and the specific rules for those add-on codes in Part 4. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and as always, decode healthcare with Harshal.